The neighborhood had always been quiet, at least on the surface. Rows of manicured lawns, white-trimmed houses that all looked eerily similar, and an HOA that prided itself on maintaining what they called uniform harmony. But beneath that glossy exterior, tension simmered, tension that seemed to have one name, one source, and one relentless presence: Karen. For as long as Michael had lived in Maplewood Estates, he had been the target of her constant complaints. If his grass grew half an inch too tall, she was there with a written notice. If his trash can lingered near the curb 5 minutes past collection time, she was already snapping photos. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed enforcer of rules no one else seemed to care about. And when the HOA elected her president last year, her authority became absolute. At first, Michael had tried to ignore it. He had moved to Maplewood for peace and stability, not to get dragged into petty neighborhood drama. He focused on his family, his job, and his own little slice of backyard tranquility. But Karen didn't like the idea of anyone being too comfortable. She thrived on conflict, and the tall wooden fence Michael had built along the edge of his property was just the spark she needed to start her next fire. The fence wasn't outrageous. At 6 feet, it provided privacy for his children when they played in the yard, and a bit of separation from the constant eyes watching through Karen's windows across the way. To Michael, it was practical. To Karen, it was unacceptable. It began with letters, printed memos stuffed into his mailbox, signed with her neat, looping signature. Each one accused him of violating HOA guidelines. Each one demanded he remove or reduce the fence. At first, he tossed them aside, assuming it would blow over. But soon the notices turned into fines. Then the fines turned into threats of legal action. And soon, Karen was showing up at HOA meetings, rallying other board members to pressure him into submission. But Michael wasn't a man who caved easily. If anything, the more Karen pushed, the more determined he became to hold his ground. He had followed the county regulations when building his fence. He had permits, receipts, and even the contractors signed approval. Karen's objections weren't about legality, they were about control. Neighbors began whispering about the feud. Some secretly supported Michael, admitting they admired how he stood up to her. Others kept quiet, afraid of becoming Karen's next target. But everyone watched, curious about who would win. One evening, as the sun set over Maplewood Estates, Michael stood in his backyard, staring at the fence. On the other side, he could hear Karen's voice carrying through the air as she barked orders into her phone, no doubt discussing her latest HOA crusade. Something in him snapped that night. He realized he was done playing defense. If Karen wanted a war, he was ready to give her one. The plan began forming in his mind, simple but powerful. If she hated his 6-foot fence, she was going to absolutely despise what came next. Michael decided he would raise it higher, taller than regulation, taller than reason. A wall of defiance that would loom over Karen's pristine backyard like a monument to everything she couldn't control. But he wasn't reckless. He knew how to work within the cracks of the HOA's rules. He researched loopholes, consulted with professionals, and found creative ways to bend the guidelines in his favor. His new design wasn't just a fence, it was an act of calculated rebellion. As he sketched out the blueprints late into the night, a sense of excitement coursed through him. For too long, Karen had dictated the terms of life in the neighborhood. For too long, she had thrived on intimidation. But this time, Michael would set the tone. The next morning, he called the contractor. The man chuckled when he heard the idea, but agreed to take the job. Materials were ordered, permits were double-checked. Everything was lined up perfectly, and Karen had no idea what was coming. Over the following week, trucks began arriving at Michael's house. Lumber stacked high, tools clanging, workers moving. In and out, Karen was on her porch every morning, hands on her hips, glaring across the property line. The noise of hammers and saws was like a battle drum echoing across the neighborhood, and when the first towering posts went up, she completely lost it. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, sipping coffee as they watched the spectacle unfold. Michael's fence wasn't just tall, it was massive. Each new board climbed higher, casting shadows into Karen's backyard. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement, a bold declaration that Michael wasn't going to be bullied anymore. Karen stormed over repeatedly, waving her HOA binder, shouting about violations and consequences. But Michael didn't flinch. The contractors ignored her. The fence kept rising. And with each passing day, the neighborhood's loyalty began to shift. People were tired of Karen's reign of terror. Watching Michael stand his ground was like seeing a hero rise. By the time the final board was nailed in place, the fence stood nearly 10 feet tall, towering, solid, and impossible to ignore. Karen's once open view of the street, the yards, and her neighbors was gone, sealed off by the wall she had created herself through her endless complaints. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What began as Karen's attempt to tear Michael down had backfired spectacularly. She had demanded he lower his fence, and in return, he had built it higher, just for her. But this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and as Michael leaned against the newly built wall, listening to the muffled sound of her outrage on the other side, he knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only heating up.